Today, we are tearing into the complex and I think often contradictory story of San Francisco. It's a city that's, globally famous for its radical tech innovation, its progressive politics, and, well, recently for a seemingly sudden and really radical pivot toward pervasive high-tech surveillance. We're going to show you how a crisis, one driven by economic panic and public perception, completely trumped data and systematically dismantled these long-standing privacy laws.
We're examining a set of sources here that meticulously detail the city's policy response to what was widely described in the media as an urban doom loop, a narrative of chaos and just spiraling decline. So our mission today is to really unpack the San Francisco surveillance paradox, this urgent, controversial, and very costly expansion of surveillance technology that happened at the very moment official data shows crime was actually dropping significantly.
Okay, let's unpack this, because for years, headlines just screamed about San Francisco being in a full-blown crisis mode. They were using these incredibly inflammatory terms like post-apocalyptic and failed city. This narrative was amplified by powerful figures, including Elon Musk, who famously called the city a derelict zombie apocalypse back in 2023. You saw it. The visible social decay, the homeless encampments, the shuttered storefronts, and this story of chaos completely dominated the public conversation, both locally and, frankly, nationally. And crucially, the sources highlight how this fear was galvanized by visceral, viral imagery.
That's exactly right. The tipping point, it wasn't a sudden spike in homicides or anything like that. It was the proliferation of visible, disturbing videos of disorder. You had footage of a homeless man attacking a former city official, for instance, or these high-profile retail thefts, these incidents captured on, shaky cell phone or security cameras, and then just amplified relentlessly by social media and national news. They turned the abstract doom loop into an immediate emotional rallying cry. The perception of chaos demanded a visible, immediate, and, a technological response.
And that narrative of chaos became this irresistible political engine. It created immense, almost unbearable pressure on city officials to do something visible about public safety and disorder. But here is the paradox we have to confront, and it is the central finding of our sources. When you looked at the verifiable data, the numbers released by the mayor's office and law enforcement, the city was statistically becoming safer, even as this visible disorder was peaking.
Dramatically safer, in fact. According to California's own reporting, overall violent crime in San Francisco was down a remarkable 22% in 2025 compared to 2024. Homicides were registering at lows not seen in 70 years. And if you look back 5 years to 2019, homicides were down a staggering 45%. We are not talking about small statistical fluctuations here. We're talking about massive, sustained decreases in the most serious categories of crime, the ones that traditionally dictate public safety policy.
That's a powerful point. So how do our sources explain that contradiction? If the city is demonstrably safer by nearly every metric that counts towards major crime indices, why the political urgency to dismantle hard-won privacy protections, to accelerate police operational expansion, and to welcome these unprecedented levels of private, big-money influence into core public safety functions?
The sources suggest the motivation shifted entirely. It went from responding to statistical crime to responding to perceived disorder and economic anxiety. So the policy response focused on two things. First, addressing quality of life crimes, so things like property theft and visible homelessness, which were fueling the public fear. And second, providing a strong signal, particularly to the business community, that the city was capable of regaining control, even if that control meant sacrificing privacy safeguards.
So our deep dive is going to focus on how this fear-driven narrative fueled legislative changes like Proposition E, and how it simultaneously opened the door for wealthy private donors, specifically crypto billionaires, to influence the very mechanisms of municipal governance, fundamentally challenging the city's democratic oversight mechanisms. We're basically tracing the thread from a single viral video clip all the way to a complete overhaul of San Francisco's commitment to civil liberties. Let's start by drilling down into the urban doom loop itself. Because while the headlines quickly centered on crime and disorder, the sources remind us that the original structural definition of this crisis was purely economic.
Absolutely. The sources define the doom loop not as a social collapse, but as a self-perpetuating downward fiscal spiral. It was triggered by structural changes, primarily the rise of remote work post-COVID-19. It's an economic term actually coined by a Columbia University professor to describe the commercial real estate crisis, but it was quickly hijacked, and reframed by the media to describe social and public safety decay.
And the economic shock data is really tangible. It illustrates that structural root cause perfectly. This wasn't just some cyclical recession. This was a fundamental shift. We saw vacant office space increase by a staggering 290% compared to pre-pandemic levels. 290%, that's 3 times the vacancy rate, rendering huge portions of the financial district functionally inert.
And that structural shift is the linchpin of the doom loop mechanism. It's the whole thing. When tens of thousands of white-collar workers leave the downtown core or transition to fully remote work, demand for office space just collapses. Transit use on BART, the subway system in those commercial corridors, it plummeted by 75%. And you have to think of the cascade effect. The loss of commuter foot traffic devastates the local retail ecosystem. The coffee shops, the lunch spots, the dry cleaners.
Right. And the most critical mechanism for the city's budget is the property tax valuation. If the commercial properties are devalued by that 290% vacancy, the city's tax revenue engine just slows to a crawl.
Precisely. That devaluation reduces property tax revenue, which is the capital you need to fund services.
Right.
Everything from street cleaning and library maintenance to, yes, police budgets. So fewer services then accelerate the departure of remaining residents and businesses, completing the vicious cycle. The city loses the money required to look and feel functional, which then reinforces the initial narrative of decay.
And this is where the crisis of perception accelerates the problem. It translates an economic challenge into a public safety panic. The media narrative acts as a kind of destructive feedback loop, translating that economic anxiety directly into fear.
The sensationalized reporting, using hyperbole like post-apocalyptic and failed city, it doesn't just damage civic pride, it actively discourages the very corporate investment and tourism needed to refill those commercial spaces. The fear of lawlessness, even if it's not rooted in a rise in homicide or violent crime rates, becomes a tangible economic loss. It reduces demand for downtown commercial services, and it scares off investors.
And yet, amidst all this, the sources quote Mayor Lurie, contrasting this perception with reality, saying overall crime was down nearly 30% and that car break-ins, which, let's be honest, were the single biggest driver of public frustration, were 22-year lows. Governor Newsom also cited significant drops statewide, and specifically in San Francisco.
What's fascinating here is the statistical anomaly. I mean, the absolute disconnect between what people were reading and seeing versus what the cold, hard crime data was showing. And we must remember that while the volume of violence was low, the type of crime that was visible was high. Visible nuisance crime creates panic far more effectively than a statistically low but serious violent crime rate.
So let's look closely at the verifiable numbers, comparing January 2024 to January 2023.
The comparison is stark. Violent crime was down 11%. Property crime, which includes the nuisance and quality of life crimes that fuel that doom loop perception, was down 32%. That figure alone should have diffused the panic, but it didn't.
And if we connect this to the specific crime that creates the most anxiety and generates the most viral footage, larceny theft, which covers car break-ins and retail theft, that was down 39%. When you compare January 2024 to the 3-year pre-pandemic average, property crime was down 40% overall, and violent crime was down 24%.
So the city was statistically safer in 2024 than it was before the pandemic. Yet the political atmosphere suggested it was necessary to embark on this costly, controversial technology expansion and dismantle privacy protections that were built up over decades. This establishes the baseline. The policy response was driven by a crisis of perception, economic anxiety tied to office vacancies, and the emotional leverage of viral videos. Not by the raw crime data. We are trading away privacy for an emotionally satisfying but statistically unnecessary response.
This fear-driven momentum then immediately ran up against San Francisco's legacy of privacy protection. For decades, San Francisco had attempted to be a leader in the democratic governance of technology, an effort that was systematically eroded by Proposition E.
That's absolutely key. San Francisco had a truly progressive history on tech governance centered around the 2019 Surveillance Ordinance. It's known as Chapter 19B of the Administrative Code. This law was groundbreaking. It was the nation's first ban on municipal facial recognition technology, signaling the city's willingness to push back against surveillance creep.
And Chapter 19B was about much more than just banning one specific technology. It was a comprehensive law designed to ensure democratic oversight. The ordinance mandated that every city department, including the SFPD, had to create a detailed surveillance impact report and a surveillance technology policy for any new system. And most importantly, they needed public review and approval before acquiring or using new systems. It was designed to keep the public and the Board of Supervisors in proactive control.
It was a robust system of checks and balances. It required transparency and debate before deployment. However, what's crucial to note is that governance was already failing even before the legislative changes from Prop E. An audit conducted years after the law passed revealed that 31 technologies that city departments were already using still lacked approved use plans. This shows that the city struggled, really struggled, to maintain compliance and oversight, even under the older, stricter rules. And that created a vulnerability that Prop E just exploited.
And then came the passage of Proposition E in 2024, backed heavily by business interests demanding a stronger police response to the perception of disorder. This is where the systematic weakening of Chapter 19B really begins, prioritizing police operational expediency over accountability.
Prop E essentially created a massive operational loophole, a huge one. Under Chapter 19B, the SFPD might have had, say, a 90-day window to draft a proposal, followed by public comment periods and a vote. Prop E threw that proactive process out the window. It allows the SFPD to deploy and use new surveillance technology for up to 1 year, a full 12 months, before even submitting a formal use policy to the Board of Supervisors.
That distinction is monumental. It shifts oversight entirely from proactive prevention to reactive review of a system that's already entrenched. If the board had to approve the technology before the police bought it, they were holding the purse strings and the power. Now, they are reviewing technology that has been operational for a year.
And that operational reality changes the political calculus entirely. By the time the public gets to weigh in, the technology is already fully deployed. Officers are trained on it, infrastructure is in place, and its use is normalized. It becomes politically and practically impossible to claw back a system that the department can argue is successfully fighting crime. And the ordinance allows the police department to continue using the technology throughout the often protracted approval process, ensuring zero interruption.
Beyond just weakening the timeline, Prop E included specific technological exemptions that are highly concerning because they carve out wide areas of police action from democratic review. It provided a blanket waiver for public safety cameras, exempting systems like LVT mobile units entirely from 19B requirements.
Right. And the purpose of that specific exemption was to accelerate the deployment of these temporary mobile surveillance towers, the ones that can be placed quickly in high-visibility areas like the financial district. Proponents argued these units were essential for rapidly addressing disorder. Critics argued it allowed the proliferation of cameras without any public debate over location, data storage, or, necessity.
And here's where it gets really interesting, diving into the previously banned technology. The source explicitly mentions the most concerning loophole. Prop E specifically exempted the use of drones in vehicle pursuits, and in doing so, acknowledged that this use could potentially include facial recognition technology.
This is a textbook example of a regulatory end run. San Francisco banned municipal facial recognition in 2019. So by exempting drones used in pursuits and explicitly noting that such use could involve biometric capabilities, Prop E provides a direct, sanctioned pathway for the SFPD to utilize the very biometric technology that the city explicitly banned 5 years prior. They are circumventing the foundational privacy mandate through a hyper-specific legislative sleight of hand focused on high-speed operational use cases.
And the sources show the scale of the expanding arsenal the SFPD is building, centralized at the new Real-Time Investigation Center, or RTIC. The goal, according to the mayor's office, is to leverage innovative technology to solve crime. The SFPD's surveillance technology inventory lists key categories already deployed or planned: automated license plate readers, ALPR, biometric processing software, and drones.
And they are investing heavily in the digital forensic side of investigation, which requires mass data acquisition. The inventory mentions upcoming policies for software tools like Macquisition and OpenText in case of forensic. We need to be clear about what these tools are. These aren't just filing cabinets for digital files.
No, these are sophisticated digital evidence retrieval systems.
Exactly. These tools are used for deep forensic analysis. They can recover deleted files, map years of communication metadata, reconstruct timelines of activity, and extract massive volumes of social media, email, and internet communications data from seized devices. Essentially, these software suites allow the police to build a full, comprehensive digital profile of an individual, often relying on data collected without that individual's explicit knowledge or consent. And they're critical for loading and analyzing data feeds from all those newly deployed cameras and ALPR systems.
The core conflict here is that as the technology becomes more complex, moving from simple CCTV cameras to AI-enabled data analysis software, The ability of the city's democratic bodies, like the Board of Supervisors, to keep pace and maintain meaningful, technically informed oversight just diminishes rapidly. It becomes a discussion of proprietary algorithms the city doesn't understand versus the operational necessities of the police force, which is always an uneven fight. And that leads us directly into the issue of money and power. The erosion of legislative checks and balances coincided perfectly with the introduction of massive private wealth directly funding core police operations. This is the ultimate privatization of public safety.
And the mechanism enabling this privatization is the Police Foundation, specifically the San Francisco Police Community Foundation, or SFPDCF. These operate as semi-public fundraising arms designed to acquire technology, specialized training, and gear that the traditional municipal budget might reject or delay due to public debate, political opposition, or simply a lack of funds.
So if the Board of Supervisors, acting as representatives of the people, won't allocate tax dollars for controversial surveillance tech due to public opposition, the Police Foundation just raises the money privately and completely bypasses the entire democratic budgetary process. It creates a parallel funding structure.
And this parallel funding structure creates a massive accountability gap, a huge one. Because these police foundations are technically private nonprofits, they resist transparency requirements and public records requests. They form an opaque layer of governance, acting as gatekeepers. So when policing functions become financially dependent on private, often wealthy, donors, democratic accountability is severely diminished. You have to ask, who is the police department truly serving the public, or the specific private interests that funded their latest arsenal?
The primary figure tied to this specific surge of surveillance funding is crypto billionaire Chris Larsen, the founder of Ripple Labs. He wasn't just a tangential supporter. He was a major financial backer of Proposition E, the very measure that gutted the privacy rules.
His influence goes much deeper than just political donations. Much deeper. Larsen donated $9.4 million through the SFPDCF for the new Real-Time Investigation Center, the RTIC headquarters. This is the operational brain of the entire surveillance network. And this included covering things like the $2 million lease for the financial district building at 315 Montgomery Street.
Now, that location is highly symbolic and politically charged. That specific building is part of a complex partially owned by the Trump Organization, and the space was formerly occupied by Larsen's own company, Ripple Labs. The sources suggest Ripple maintains the lease for the SFPD, or at least that the arrangement is highly intertwined with Larsen's corporate history.
This specific multi-million-dollar arrangement is profoundly risky. It reinforces the perception that surveillance priorities are aligned with protecting elite commercial interests, specifically the revitalization of the financial district, which was the epicenter of the economic doom loop. It risks compromising municipal sovereignty by making core policing functions financially beholden to a single private donor. And that risks a system where the whims of private interests and their preferred commercial zones can override the broader, equitably distributed public safety needs of the city.
So if the RTVs is the brain of the surveillance network, private companies like Flock Safety are the tendrils stretching out across the city, providing ubiquitous eyes and ears. Flock provides extensive automated license plate reader, or ALPR, cameras.
Flock is a crucial, rapidly expanding part of this ecosystem nationwide. Their cameras are deployed not only via city contracts, but often through third parties like business improvement districts, homeowners associations, HOAs, and neighborhood associations. And the data collected, which is detailed records of vehicular movement and location, is stored on private, proprietary servers. And importantly, the contractual agreements allow for sharing with federal and out-of-state agencies.
And the data sharing has already led to documented abuses in San Francisco. The ACLU NorCal revealed through public records requests that the SFPD was caught sharing ALPR data with out-of-state law enforcement specifically for federal immigration investigations. They documented a staggering 1.6 million illegal searches, including 19 explicitly coordinated with ICE.
That 1.6 million figure is deeply troubling because it shows the sheer scale of unauthorized access and use that can occur when technology is deployed without proactive, strong democratic oversight. Furthermore, reporting revealed that Customs and Border Patrol CBP, a federal agency, reportedly routinely searched Flock Safety's network of over 80,000 cameras nationwide without the knowledge of the local police departments that operated them.
Wait, so the local police departments are installing the cameras under the pretense of local public safety.
Yeah.
But the data becomes a massive national surveillance asset, accessible by federal agencies for purposes that local law enforcement may not even support, like immigration enforcement.
That is the fundamental risk illustrated by the sources. When public safety infrastructure is outsourced to private entities like Flock, the privacy limits placed on government by constitutional principles or local ordinances, like Chapter 19b, don't always apply equally to the private companies collecting and storing the data. Flock is ultimately responsible to its investors first for maximizing its surveillance network, not to the principles of privacy and civil liberties cherished by San Francisco residents.
So we have a system driven by narrative fear and viral video, backed by powerful private money that skirts democratic accountability and expanding exponentially through legislative loopholes like Prop E. After all this cost, all this political turmoil, and all this sacrifice of privacy, the obvious question then becomes, does it actually work? What is the demonstrable efficacy of this pervasive surveillance?
That's where we turn to external studies. And the evidence on camera efficacy is fundamentally mixed and heavily context-dependent. It is certainly not the silver bullet to crime that the proponents, like the backers of Prop E, often claim it is. And this must be taken into account when assessing the huge cost to civil liberties.
Let's review those studies from the Urban Institute analyzing surveillance systems in Baltimore, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. What specific conditions led to success, and where did the systems fail?
Well, they found highly varied results, indicating that the mere presence of a camera is meaningless without an operational strategy. In Baltimore, for example, after saturating the downtown area with cameras and actively monitoring the live feeds 24/7, they saw significant success. Total crime, violent crime, and larceny declined by more than 30 incidents per month compared to control areas. The system was deemed cost beneficial, saving about $1.50 for every $1 spent in that target area.
So saturation plus active human monitoring seems to be the formula for success in that context.
Precisely. And Chicago had similar targeted success in high crime areas. In Humboldt Park, the installation of police observation devices, often mobile camera units, was likely responsible for a nearly 12% drop in the crime rate. Crucially, the system justified its cost with a significant return, $4.30 saved for every $1 spent on the system in that specific area alone. That's a strong argument for targeted, resource-intensive deployment.
But the mixed part of the data is crucial when San Francisco is considering a citywide expansion. In other targeted areas within the same cities like North Avenue in Baltimore, West Garfield Park in Chicago, or areas of Washington, D.C., the cameras produced no measurable change in crime rates. In fact, some areas saw crime simply displaced to nearby, non-monitored streets.
Right. And the failure was almost always attributed to logistical or operational shortcomings, a lack of active, round-the-clock monitoring, or insufficient camera density to provide effective coverage. For instance, in D.C., the study found that cameras alone did not appear to have an effect on crime, which is why a cost-benefit analysis wasn't even calculated there. The system was functionally useless. This suggests that simply installing the equipment, which is what Prop E speeds up, is not enough. It requires massive ongoing operational investment to be effective.
That's a sobering finding, especially considering the promises made to justify Prop E. Beyond just statistical crime reduction, there's a deeper question of what surveillance does to the fabric of the community itself. Does a camera make you feel safer? And if so, for whom?
This is critical, and the sources pointed to research on the effect of surveillance on safety perceptions, particularly among vulnerable populations. The research, which analyzed the impact of security cameras on residents, highlights the indispensable role of human factors and institutional trust. They found that surveillance cameras significantly enhance safety perceptions only for local residents, so people who already have high institutional trust in the police and strong community embeddedness.
Meaning, if you already trust the system, the camera confirms that trust. But what about the transient or marginalized groups that Prop E proponents claim to be helping by restoring order?
The effect was vastly different for vulnerable groups, specifically migrants, who often lack strong, established community ties and may distrust state institutions. For these populations, surveillance cameras had a limited impact on perceived safety. The cameras only improved their sense of safety when they were complemented by robust, intimate social relationships. Things like neighborhood mutual assistance and genuine interpersonal trust toward neighbors.
So if you feel secure because your neighbors look out for you and you have institutional support, the camera adds a layer of confidence. But if you lack those fundamental social bonds, the underlying foundation of community, the camera does very little to alleviate the structural insecurity or fear that defines the doom loop feeling. Technology in this context cannot replace community.
And that leads directly to the ultimate cost, the cost to civil liberties and democracy. Surveillance technologies conflict fundamentally with democratic political culture, which is based on a foundational agreement for privacy and civil liberty protections. Even if the technology reduces crime in one neighborhood, its mere existence, especially when unchecked, risks undermining the core democratic values of the entire city.
And we don't have to look far for proof of this inherent risk in San Francisco specifically, which is why the original privacy law, Chapter 19B, was created in the first place. The sources remind us of the very recent chilling abuse, where the SFPD illegally accessed private security cameras to surveil Black Lives Matter protesters in 2020.
That incident serves as a perfect cautionary tale for the Prop E era. In 2020, without public knowledge or approval, the SFPD access surveillance feeds from a network of private cameras, not even their own municipal network, to monitor the activities of people exercising their constitutional rights to protest. This was done in direct contradiction to the spirit and the letter of the city's established surveillance policies at the time.
This demonstrates the chilling effect in real time. When surveillance systems are unchecked or used covertly, they pose a massive threat to protected First Amendment activities. The department bypassed clear privacy rules to spy on political activists, reinforcing the necessity of proactive rather than reactive democratic control over these systems, which is exactly what Prop E dismantled. This has been a deep dive into the cycle that drove San Francisco's rapid turn toward pervasive surveillance. We have traced the narrative thread from economic panic and viral videos all the way to a major legislative overhaul. Let's summarize the key findings for the listener.
San Francisco responded to a perceived crisis, the economic and narrative doom loop, with a technology-led expansion of surveillance that was largely decoupled from the reality of crime trends, which were actually quite favorable. This was a response to perception, not data.
And this response systematically dismantled the city's foundational privacy protections through Proposition E, creating dangerous legislative loopholes, especially those that shifted oversight from proactive to reactive, and those that might enable the use of previously banned facial recognition via drone deployment in specific operational scenarios.
Most critically, this expansion was heavily funded and shaped by private interests, particularly a single crypto billionaire. He channeled millions through police foundations that operate outside the transparency and public accountability demanded of municipal spending. This creates a severe risk of policing priorities aligning with elite commercial and financial interests rather than the democratically determined needs of all residents.
As we look forward, the challenge is only accelerating because technology is not standing still. The speed of change, 5G and 6G, the Internet of Things, highly autonomous systems, is generating surveillance capabilities much faster than any level of global governance has been able to match.
And the role of AI increases the complexity exponentially, particularly in the real-time investigation center. AI algorithms used for data analytics and predictive policing are often proprietary intellectual property. This means there is a fundamental lack of transparency. The public cannot audit the source code, leading to increased ethical concerns around algorithmic bias and equity, making resolution incredibly difficult. I mean, if the algorithm is proprietary, how can you challenge its findings in court or ensure it's not racially biased?
Furthermore, as AI systems are given more decision-making capabilities, say flagging a person as suspicious based on behavioral patterns, the complex question of liability arises. If an AI-enabled system makes a decision that leads to human harm or an unlawful stop, who is ultimately responsible? The police officer, the city, or the private company that designed the proprietary algorithm? This remains dangerously unresolved.
San Francisco serves as a powerful case study for the global tension between the state's increasing reliance on the private sector for surveillance technology and the fundamental democratic principle of public accountability. They outsource the technology and they outsource the funding, complicating accountability at every step.
The source material here leaves us with a provocative thought that applies not just to California, but worldwide. The power dynamic has fundamentally shifted. Since the private sector companies like Flock or the proprietary software makers is the primary driver of surveillance growth globally, and the surveillance limits placed on government by constitutional law don't always apply equally to corporate entities.
How can citizens worldwide ensure that the powerful technology developed for profit, which has an inherent business incentive to maximize data collection and deployment, does not ultimately become an unchecked extension of government control? The private sector is eroding privacy laws that do not apply equally to corporate entities, allowing them to gather data that governments are explicitly forbidden from collecting. This widening gap between government constraints and corporate freedom is the battleground of the future for civil liberties.
A fascinating and ultimately urgent question to end on. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive.
Always a pleasure.